All right, I'm going to do another reading out of the issue number 43 of Micro Cornucopia. The name of this article is Fast Fractals, Programming the 386 under MS-DOS. This is one of our trick articles. The fractals are really just a sneaky way to get your attention. After all, how many of you would read an article about speeding up 386 software by a factor of 100? As excitement over the 386 dies down, we're left with an uncomfortable feeling. A 32-bit operating system, one that will provide memory management over huge address spaces, is a long way off, and when it comes, it will cost a lot. But don't despair. The 386 has many powerful features that can be used under a 16-bit operating system, features that can give your programs a real kick. This article shows how to use 32-bit instructions on the 386 under MS-DOS. As an example, we'll turbocharge the familiar Mandelbrot zoom. Our 386 version will use fixed point math to obtain the equivalent of 1 MFLOPS, which is million floating point operations per second, without a math coprocessor. Consequently, the program will take minutes, not the usual hours or days, to produce fractal diagrams like Figure 1. And don't worry guys, you're not missing out on this particular picture. And I remember an issue of Micro Cornucopia having this exact same picture on their front cover. To show how simple the process is, the program will be written for a 16-bit C compiler/assembler, that is, a compiler/assembler that doesn't understand 386 mnemonics. I begin with an overview of 386 modes, then move into a brief discussion of the Mandelbrot calculation and fixed point math. To minimize repetition, I'll assume you've read Larry Fogg's article on the Mandelbrot set, which is in Micro C's issue number 39, and Earl Henrich's article on fixed point Micro C issue number 41. Another useful reference is the 386-387 architecture by S. Morse, E. Isaacson, and D. Albert. Modes. The 386 has 3 modes: real, protected, and virtual. Real mode is the default, or how the processor wakes up after you turn on the computer. Segments in real mode are 16 bits long, and there are no memory protection schemes. When the 386 gets nudged into protected mode, the segments can be 32 bits long, allowing huge address spaces, and all sorts of multitasking and memory protection features become available. V8086 mode is very handy for running old 8086 applications within a multitasking operating system. Programs under V8086 behave very much like real mode programs. And if it wasn't very clear, the V stands for virtual. In all modes, it's possible to access 32-bit registers and use 32-bit instructions. The 32-bit extensions of the familiar 8086 registers are called EAX, EBX, ECX, EDX, EDI. Okay, so especially for anybody who's seen my older videos on the x86 architecture, you're going to know the name of these registers. The lower 16 bits of these registers can still be accessed as AX, BX, etc. MS-DOS is designed for real mode, so that's the mode we'll use. By default, instructions in real mode operate on 8 or 16-bit quantities. To use 32-bit operands, an instruction must be prefixed with an override byte. 66H for register operations and 67H for addressing. And remember, if you ever have any questions, you can definitely leave them in the comments below. For anyone who doesn't know, H stands for hexadecimal, so we're looking at a hexadecimal number there. If you have a 386 assembler, you won't have to worry about all the override bytes. You can freely mix 16-bit and 32-bit instructions in the same assembly language program, and the assembler will automatically insert the overrides in the object code. If you don't have a 386 assembler, you can still use the 32-bit instructions by inserting DB66H before a 16-bit instruction. Normally, dB, define byte, is used in the data segment, but most assemblers also allow dBs encode. If there is no corresponding 16-bit instruction, you can put the entire byte encoding for the operation after a dB. For example, to code the 386 instructions. And then I'm not going to type out the assembly. You're not missing much. They are just showing the difference between 386 instructions and a non-386 assembler written in non-386 assembly as well. The first instruction is easy, since the older 8086 processors have a 16-bit add that corresponds exactly to the 32-bit add. However, we have to replace the SHLD with a byte encoding, since the earlier processors had no double shift instructions. Byte encodings can be determined from any good 386 programming guide. The next section is defined bytes. I don't know why Word Dictate didn't type exactly what I said, SHLD. Oh, and they give us another interpretation. Why can't it just type the exact letters I say? Anyways, the next section is called defined bytes. There are good reasons for using the DB approach. Even if you have a 386 assembler, for example, it is often desirable to call an assembly language function from a high-level language. Many compilers require that the function be assembled with a particular version of Microsoft's MASM. Unfortunately, MASM puts a peculiar head on functions assembled specifically for 386 real mode, even if the function contains nothing but 8086 instructions. The header is enough to confuse the heck out of non-Microsoft linkers, like the linker for Turbo C. The DB approach circumvents the header problem, since you have to tell the assembler that the module contains 386 code. Furthermore, many C compilers come up with their own assemblers. Typically, these assemblers can't understand 386 mnemonics, so there's no alternative to the DB method. I've taken the DB approach in this article because it is the most general, and because my favorite compiler is DESMET. Okay, I just typed that out rather than rely on Microsoft Dictate. So that's his favorite compiler, which doesn't understand 386 mnemonics. All right, I'll skip the Mandelbrot calculations section. There's a lot of math in there. I'll jump to the section titled Fixed Point Math. One way to speed up the Mandelbrot calculations, especially on computers that don't have floating point hardware, for example, a 8387 or 8287 math coprocessor, is to substitute fixed point for floating point math. This idea isn't new. See, for example, the article by H. Katz in Dr. Dobbs' journal, November 1986. However, the 386 has instructions that make fixed point math very easy and very fast. Fixed point numbers have an integer and a fractional portion separated by a conceptual binary point. In our program, we'll store fixed point numbers as 32-bit integers, with the integer portion in the upper 8 bits, and the fractional portion in the lower 24 bits. Thus, the binary point is between bits 23 and 24. With this system, we can represent positive or negative numbers with absolute values between 6 times 10 to the negative 8 and 127. 0.999999. That range is fine for Mandelbrot diagrams. X and Y will never get too big because the calculation will stop if either xn to the 2 or yn to the 2 exceeds 4. And it turns out that the regions of the diagram with both P and Q less than 0.25 are pretty uninteresting. Fixed point numbers are added, subtracted, and compared just like ordinary 32-bit integers, but multiplication is slightly more complicated. To calculate the fixed point product of x and y, we might try the C statement. And then they show the formula in C. He goes on to say that is the integer product x times y must be divided by 2 to the 24. He gives us the number that it equals, and he says to get the correct fixed point product, well, you would access the value of the code he showed. Now he says there's a problem with this C code. The product x times y could be 64 bits long, which would cause overflow in most compiled code. The problem disappears in assembly language since most 32-bit processors have no trouble multiplying 32-bit numbers to form a 64-bit product. For example, suppose we have two fixed point numbers stored in the 386 registers EAX and EBX. To multiply these numbers and place the fixed point product in EDX requires only two instructions. Okay, this time I did type out the assembly code. Just note the beginning of those two lines should have lowercase letters. It goes on to say that IMUL places the 64-bit product in the register pair EDX: EAX. The high bits in EDX and the double shift instruction adjust the binary point. We shift left by 8 bits instead of right by 24 bits because we want the product to end up in EDX. Some programmers prefer fixed point with 16-bit integer and 16-bit fractional portions. However, as I've seen Mandelbrot calculations done with the 16/16 format, and the inaccuracies were pretty obvious even at most magnifications. So that's a shame this issue isn't uploaded to the internet, at least not archive.org. If you happen to find a link to this, I'd appreciate it if you put it in the comments. I'll go ahead and take a few pictures because I don't have a scanner, but I'll take a picture of the 5 blocks of code in this particular article. And now I'll jump to the very end of the article where it's titled Final Words. He says we barely skirted the 386 features you can use under MS-DOS. We didn't cover advanced addressing modes, nor all the powerful new instructions. The 386 is full of goodies such as BSF and BSR, which stands for bit scan forward and bit scan reverse, which makes software floating point fast and very easy. It's important to explore. The chip has so much potential. It would be criminal to use the 386 as nothing more than a fast 286. Instead of chewing your fingernails while Microsoft inflates OS 2 a few more megabytes, start lacing your MS-DOS programs with high-speed 32-bit instructions. Yes, you're still stuck with the 16-bit segments, but how many of your programs really need data structures larger than 64K? Probably very few, and the OS 2 can't help you with that problem anyways. When the protected mode operating system finally rolls around, you'll be that much ahead of the pack. And that's it. Thanks for watching.